Hi, I'm Andi Schwartz, and this is Still Brazen, 20 Years of Queering Femininity, a podcast celebrating the 20th anniversary of the publication of the book Brazen Femme, Queering Femininity. This podcast was created at the Center for Feminist Research at York University in Toronto, a place also known as Toronto. The current treaty holders of this land are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and it has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. Place has been really central to the conversations we've been having so far on this podcast, and maybe most especially in the episode you're about to hear. The femme culture we've been revisiting is really specific to Toronto and has been shaped by the particularities of Toronto, and I know everyone who has taken part in these conversations has a lot of gratitude for the land and the place. This final episode of the podcast brings together the editors of Brazen Femme, Chloë Brushwood and Anna Camilleri. Chloë Brushwood is a professor of education at York University. Her research and writing take up visual and arts-based research methods, community-engaged media, self-representation and narrative, and feminist and queer cultures. Chloë has published widely in books and journals, including Qualitative Studies in Education, Gender in Education, and Visual Studies, and is co-author and co-editor of several books, including the Lambda finalist, Brazen Femme, Queering Femininity, with Anna Camilleri. Anna Camilleri is an interdisciplinary artist with a body of work that spans literature, interdisciplinary performance, and visual public artwork and installation. Her book publications, including Brazen Femme, Queering Femininity, co-edited with Chloë Brushwood, have been recognized with distinctions from the Lambda Literary Foundation, the Association of Independent Publishers, and the American Library of Congress. She is an intergenerational LGBT artist residency alum, the University of Toronto Scarborough Department of Arts, Media, and Culture artist residency alum, a Centennial College Theatre Arts and Performance sessional professor, and a Toronto Arts Council / Metropolitan Toronto University Leaders Lab Fellow. Anna is a founding artistic co-director of Redefine Arts, which was established in 2005 as Red Dress Productions. So I have known Chloë for almost 10 years. She was my supervisor as a grad student, and she also introduced me to Anna's work. And then Anna was our keynote speaker at the Critical Femininities Conference last year. So it has been really wonderful to continue thinking about femme with them through this podcast. This conversation is really beautiful. Chloë and Anna have been collaborators basically since they met in Toronto in the 90s. They edited Brazen Femme, of course, the book we've been revisiting and celebrating, but they also worked together on the book Boys Like Her, Trans Fictions, which was created by the Taste This collective that Anna co-founded. That book has been referenced many times already in this podcast. They also curated a program for the Inside Out Film Festival called Femme Frenzy and an installment of the Strange Sisters Cabaret that was once a fixture at the Buddies in Bad Times Theatre. They told me about how these collaborations have deepened and nourished their friendship, and their closeness is really evident when you listen to them talk. I always tear up when anyone starts talking about femship, and they had some really touching things to say about that too. This conversation went to some really deep places. They told me about femme life in Toronto in the 90s, the fun and wild-sounding parties, of course, but also how it was set against the backdrop of the Montreal Massacre and ongoing misogynist violence that made being femme such an act of bravery. They also take us along a femme evolution, how being femme has changed with age, with life, and where they find femme now, connected to land, to heritage, and always to each other. I don't want to give it all away, so we'll get to the conversation now as they start at the beginning, telling the story, I think for the first time, about how they met. So while we're talking about queer community, I wonder if I can ask you to tell me the story of how you became friends and collaborators.
A lover of mine in Vancouver became good friends with Anna and said, "Oh, you should meet Anna. You know, she's great. You would get along." And I was sort of like consumed with my jealousy about her becoming friends with Anna. So I was like, I don't need to know this Anna person, you know. And then moved to Toronto and to come to grad school, and I was at a party, and actually it was one of the first Dirty Babettes that Christy Cameron curated and put on, and it was in the backyard of a big, shared house in the West End somewhere. And I ran into Anna at this party, and because we were in Toronto and in this different context, and I felt really excited to see her there, and I was like, "Oh, I know who you are." I have a very strong visual memory of that night, both the event, the house. I can remember Anna very clearly, and I remember we were talking in the hallway. Yeah, and so that was the first time we met. We kept seeing each other, and then I did the photos for Boys Like Her, I think shortly after that.
hmm
And so it was really doing those photos, I think, that where we built our own, really like started to build our own intimacy.
I remember very well our photography sessions because they were really intimate. And,
Hmm.
we had already built a friendship, and it was a friendship that grew really quickly. I remember that we spent, I mean, it was just hours. It was like it
Hmm.
was a day that we spent together, and we were new to one another.
Hmm.
Yeah, sharing Boys Like Her. I mean, I can't imagine that book without the images.
Well, that was our first experience of collaboration
Yeah.
because it was such a collaborative process. It's true that the photos we did were actually quite intimate in some sort of typical ways, but for me, it was that when people share their creative ideas with you, to me, that's one of the most intimate things you can do because
Yeah.
it's so vulnerable to say like, this is what I think might work, or like through that whole process, we were also developing this kind of.
I think that the photo shoot or photo shoots with you, Chloe, for Boys Like Her, they were deeply collaborative, and that was part of the intimacy that was really built between us. And it took us and me so far away from the subject object dynamics and
Mhm,
relationships. I hated being photographed. I still don't like
mm,
being photographed. But the great exception for me has being was being photographed by you, and it was because I didn't feel like a subject, and that wasn't
mm,
really the nature of the relationship. So yeah, they
mhm,
were very
mhm,
intimate events that I feel really formed a basis of trust in our
mhm.
relationship. And I don't think that I would have invited you to do it if there already wasn't some trust, but
We spent a lot of time working on these different projects and also just spending time together. I mean, there was no texting or like there was no like you just to spend time, you like went to someone's house. Like
yeah.
like you just go over in the morning and then you just stay there all day. You just spend time around each other.
Yeah.
I love hearing this kind of stuff about how your friendships and your community developed and unfolded and engaged because it's so different than the context that I'm in, right? So I'm just really curious to hear a little bit more about yeah, like what was the femme community in Toronto like at that time?
I moved to Toronto in 96 and it immediately felt different to me. I felt like I arrived to a place where many of the most exciting cultural spaces were led by femmes. I wouldn't even say that femmes were necessarily identifying each other yet. I mean, that's partly, I think, why we made Brazen Femme, is that we wanted to
hmm
take what we saw and actually name it as something. And yes, people identified as femme, but there wasn't a sense that the way there is now of femme as like a site of political solidarity. That was not my experience at the time. So for me, it wasn't the femme community. There wasn't a community per se, but and the book was an attempt, I think, to build community
hmm
actually.
hmm
But there was this reality where, like, if you looked around at Desh Pardesh Festival, the and most literary events, queer literary events, Buddies in Bad Times, the leather community, the kink community, like on and on. Books, the women's bookstore, like all of these spaces had femmes at the head, at the leading,
Yeah.
like we're leading these spaces.
Yeah.
So it was just like for coming to Toronto and being like, what is this place I'm in? And it was the same like that night at Dirty Babette. Christy Cameron was putting on these cabarets. It was really the start of the cabaret scene in Toronto. And femmes were leading those events, were producing those events. So I was like, I mean, I remember arriving in Toronto and I was sleeping on the floor of someone's apartment, people I barely knew. I remember they were like, "We're going to Buddy's to the there's a dungeon night, like you should come." And I remember being like, "Okay," like having no. And I went with it, and I remember walking in. It was the main space. Like this is how popular this event was back then. The main space was this party. It was,
Oh my, it was packed.
and like there were so many femmes, like high femmes, leather femmes. I was like, oh my God. Like I was coming from a place where I felt like I couldn't even go to the bar in a dress. Like it was just shockingly different. So,
Yes. Yes.
and yet it still felt like tenuous. Like we didn't
Mhm.
feel, I don't know, Anna, if this is true for you, but it didn't feel like we had the power really. I mean, femme still felt like a dangerous position to occupy.
Yeah.
Even in queer spaces, even in queer
Yeah,
spaces.
absolutely. There were lots of femmes around, identifying as femme, identifying as diesel femme, low femme, high femme, like lots of different terms. And there was a sense of precarity. Like, my experience at the time, even though I had a kind of, I had some agency and voice and a kind of power in our communities, but there was still very much the subject object relation around femme, that
Mhm.
femme, it was assumed that femmes were attached to, some
Mhm.
masculine, that we weren't people who were moving through communities like with our own agency and our own ideas. And so how femme was located, and I would say not by me or by Chloë, but in the culture that we were moving through, was deeply disturbing, I think, to both of us, and disempowering. And so that was part of the place that Brazen Femme came from, was like, you got this wrong. Like that's not who we are.
Yeah, and Anna, I feel like, for us also in our personal experiences, like there was this also work of educating the people in our
Yeah.
lives. Like and I feel like even in our relationships with friends and lovers who especially butch identified or masculine of center friends and lovers, like there was this work of saying, no, like femme is not this, like we're not your accessory. We're not your, son, we're
Mhm.
not.
Foil, trope, appendage,
Yeah,
add
yeah,
on.
yeah. Or like,
Yeah.
yeah, or like sex toy. Like
Hmm.
it's not just
Hmm.
like, you're so I think like that was in a way you see that in the introduction to Brazen Femme, that we were like in a way some of the ideas like you were saying, Andy, seem really contemporary now because in a way now that's how femmes talk about femme. But at the time, I really feel like we were saying those things for the first time in many ways for ourselves. Like it's
Yeah.
not that other people hadn't done that. I mean, people like Joe Nussel and Amber Hollabout also had said things like this, but it felt really like new. And like, it was so femme was so tied to butch. And that's why, the book is so like in our intro, we sort of are insistent about this idea of femme on its own terms. And it's now that sort of sounds like, well, obviously, but at the time it wasn't
It wasn't
obvious. It wasn't
obvious.
obvious to anybody. Like no one had really, yeah, it felt radical at the time. I mean, it's the thing I'm proudest of about the book is that we were trying to establish that self-determination for femmes, like, and for ourselves.
Yeah. I think that's like another one of the biggest, for sure, one of the biggest impacts of that book. I was talking earlier about bringing together like art and prose as like one of the major legacies of it, but I think that's that intentional shift that it activated towards thinking about femme on its own or on our own terms. Um, I think making it an anthology was also really important because it was not just this is just what Chloë and Anna think. It was like, look, I guess I didn't really know that it was actually more of it was capturing a moment and a feeling of the time, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be brazen to to claim our self-determination, I think. Like you can't do that softly.
Yeah.
There wasn't the same political discourse around femmes. So in fact, if anything, like I think being femme still felt quite vulnerable and felt kind of dangerous and felt kind of marginalized and which
Mhm.
is again part of the reason we called it Brazen Femme, is that we were, I think, responding to a context, you know, Andy, is, like in your work, like your generation of femmes, I think there's been a real turn back to like softness and vulnerability and all
Yeah.
these kinds of things. And I think that's probably in response to your zeitgeist. For us, like our zeitgeist, we were already like softness was not what we needed. We needed like something else, to respond to the zeitgeist we were in. So yeah, and we weren't the only people. I mean, there was, I'm thinking of the Harrison Crocker anthology that came out around that time. Like there were other people were having these same thoughts, like femme needed to be thought about in new ways. And I think it was also a civil rights movement. I mean, we were responding to experience that they didn't have the same rights and like powers and, safety that other people in the queer community had. Right.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And it's
yeah.
important to name that, Chloe, because I think I have so much appreciation for femmes today who are talking about and creating work and embracing softness. But when I cast my memory back to 20 years ago and the place that Brazen Femme came from in my own life, it's important to acknowledge that in 2002, I was 32 years old. And I had experienced a lot of gender-based violence and different forms of gender-based violence, including intimate partner violence
Mm-hmm.
in queer community, as a queer person, as a femme queer person.
Mm-hmm.
So the need to really establish the frame and use that phrase on our own terms, femmes on our own terms, was really unhinging from a whole bunch of different things. One of them, like in that unspoken community narratives, like there was also violence, like the presence of
Mm-hmm.
violence, and so that toughness for me was very important. That was a very important political stance. It was necessary, and even considering softness really didn't appear on my radar until in a real way until many, many, many years later, because there was so much risk actually
Mm-hmm.
connected with softness, like acknowledging
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability or need that coming from
Mm-hmm.
that place or from that experience, right?
Yeah, it's actually very moving for me to think about, because it's like Anna and I are both people who experienced gender-based violence from early childhood, because we were girls, and because we were a particular kind of girl too. Like, so we're both survivors of violence, like lifetimes of that. And we still are ourselves. Like we were still like, no, I'm still gonna wear whatever the fuck I want to wear, and I'm still gonna be the femme I am and the girl I am, and and it was risky, and it continues to be, and it's riskier now for some women and some
Mhm.
femmes than others, like for sure. And like it just really reminds me when and Anna says that, like it was so such a sign of like life and vitality that we just continued to be ourselves in that way, and that we were like, no, we're just going to make more spaces for this. Like you don't get to tell us that we don't get to have this pleasure in ourselves, pleasure in our bodies,
Mhm.
pleasure in our sexuality and our gender experience. That does take a brazenness, I think, and it takes bravery, and the fact that we keep existing and that we kept existing as femme despite the gender-based violence we experienced or the femmephobia we experienced. Like it is radical. It is like amazingly powerful.
I was going to say too that I think it's actually taken a really long time to shake that femmephobia. So I probably started identifying as femme probably like not quite 10 years after, but get close to 10 years after like the book was published. And it still at that time, femmephobia was still very much the flavor
Yeah.
that we were experiencing. And I started my master's in 2013, so 10 years ago. And I had a grad student, like when, we had to do that introductory, this is what my master's is about. A grad student say to me, isn't it more important to be butch? Like truly perplexed by my topic and why on earth
Yes.
I'd want to study femininity and femme. And that was, I think between that point and now, I think it's like almost like a 180. Like obviously I think like you're right, femmephobia is still insidious and shifting, and it has shifted, but like the way that I think that there's been a lot of effort to appreciate femmes publicly and to like really
mobilize, this appreciation for all of the work that femmes do
Mhm,
culturally
mhm,
in the community and all that kind of thing. But
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I worry a bit. It's probably just because of my own, partly because of my own history and like the ways that that produces a particular kind of hypervigilance in me. But I
Mhm.
do worry about the quote femme appreciation. I think that it's very easy to perform that, and as many other folks can attest to, in a kind of tokenistic way, but not in a way that actually forces cultures to examine their and people to examine their assumptions and beliefs. And then when you have like H&M with like femme t-shirts, and you have, Harry
Yeah.
Styles is a femme, and like you have this white mainstream co-optation or appropriation of femme, you actually just endanger further the queerest femmes, the femmes who are most vulnerable, the femmes who are, because of transness, because of race, because of class, like for whatever reason,
Mhm.
like what other vectors of vulnerability, like I do think there's been a shift, and I'm glad, but I also worry that it's we like to feel better. So we're very quick to be like, oh, it's good now. You know, it's good now. But I
Mhm.
actually think we live in a
Mhm.
deeply, deeply misogynist and femphobic culture. So I
Yeah.
just don't think that has changed really.
Yeah, it's real because the world hasn't completely transformed, Chloe, in the last
Well,
20
no,
years, right? Like this is
yeah,
the thing. Like
yeah.
there are still yeah, there are conversations that we were having 20 and 30 years ago that we're having now. And there are civil rights that have actually disappeared in the intervening years, right? Like to acknowledge that. And I don't want to stay here too long, but I just want to acknowledge something that floated into my memory that in 1989 there was, this terrible event that's been now regarded as the Montreal Massacre.
Mm.
And I was at the time taking a couple of courses at York University. I was working full time, but I remember being up on the campus right after all of these women were murdered in Montreal. And I have this memory of these tunnels
Mhm.
on campus and is spray painted slogans, spray painted in red, saying down on your bitch knees, multiple slogans like that painted all over the campus. And I remember the feeling in my body. I was working at the time at Sistering Drop-In Center for Women, and there were some really great women who I met there.
Mm.
And one of the women was a woman named Jackie, who uh, gave me the word femme for
Mm.
myself. She was like, "You're a femme girl." And Jackie was about 10 years older than me, and a trans woman and sex worker. And so I'm just thinking, because we've been spending time talking about these histories, and it was just such a strong memory that came back to me of this seminal moment in my life of like there was something about being on campus and being and seeing these slogans that externalized something that I knew in my body, that I experienced in my life, and that really was for me a precursor
Mhm.
of identifying as femme, and the beginning of like producing work from this place of like I am choosing this identity that puts me at risk. And it's not being femme inherently that puts me at risk, but it's the, opting not to, wear a paper bag and hide, but to actually choose this site. For me, that was a really important and terrifying time in my life that
Mhm.
really, what is the word that I'm looking for? That,
It's like a catalyst or a
yeah, was a
yeah.
catalyst. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think about the ways that femme has emerged across contexts, in terms of like the ballroom scene and the sex worker communities, and because when you said that, and I thought, oh yeah, like that was, of course. I mean, we were both in our late teens at that time, like when that event happened.
Yeah,
There's something about choosing to be yourself despite those events that I think is very profound, right?
absolutely.
And also being seen by another, like in that story, you're seen by this other femme, it sounds like.
Yeah, yeah. And then taking myself to the Toronto Women's Bookstore and spending all of this time looking for like, what work do you have that's been created by femmes? And I'd spend hours in the bookstore and encountered Dorothy Allison and Jill Gomez, both that like terrible events in our history. And then this connecting like recognition of who I was, like giving me a word and a name that I really needed to understand myself, and then connecting, like making these broader cultural connections. And it's like, wow, we do exist. There's not just me, there's a whole bunch of us in different places and communities across generations, across times, across decades, across like this sense of lineage. It was the sense of lineage, and also understanding that there is like this sense of risk was not something uniquely felt by me, but felt by many. And despite the risk and the risks that we've chosen, this brazenness.
I'm just curious what you think about how, by observing and engaging with young people, how you've seen like femme identity and queer identities change. And maybe is there something hopeful in that you see?
I don't know that I feel hopeful, like, oh, everything's going to get better. Like I think that I don't know that I have that sense of linear progressive time. I think that's a really like colonial and patriarchal kind of concept. But I do have, I do feel inspired by what I imagine will be the new creative ways that people become themselves and insist on their self-determination, like continue to do that. And you see, I think, there are lots of ways of being femme now that I couldn't have imagined when I was in my 20s. And yeah, and I celebrate that. Like I think that there's always this there are growing pains and like moments of tension between generations in that way. But I think for me, like I've really come out on the other side of that feeling very excited about what younger queers are saying and expressing about femme. And I don't have to understand it. That's the awesome part, is I don't have to understand it all. I can just be like, "Ooh, this is fun." I can just watch this unfold. Like, I don't really understand non-binary femme, but I love that it exists and that I get to just like, watch it kind of be and in the world and see what it does. And I also celebrate so deeply, every femme's right to name themselves and, be themselves. So,
When I think about some of the Gen Z femmes who I know and work with, it is one of the things that I most deeply appreciate is how models of care are really talked about and externalized. And of course, Chloe, we care for one another in these really deep ways, but it's taken me such a long time to be able to identify, care as like a legitimate thing that I need to give to myself. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about Gen Z femmes, many of whom do identify as queer, non-binary femmes, is these models of mutual aid and mutual care that are, directly linked to access intimacy and that are really smart, intelligent, deeply thought out kind of systems that include like femmes across many different spaces and states of being and wellness and unwellness and an expectation of care, both given and received within community models. And that was something that we did with and for one another, Chloe, and that we've done through our friendship. But I feel like that wasn't something that was really present in our communities, that,
no.
the care is a word that just was not really on the map.
No. No, and there was a wariness too between femmes, like because we
Yeah.
were, as there often is among people like who are marginalized within a more dominant culture, which it still felt like in queer spaces. It's like, can I trust you? Are we going to compete for the same resources? Like there was this wariness, and of course that's amplified because patriarchy does that to girls and women anyway. Like it's kind of amazing how much care we did offer each other, given that we were also fighting those kinds of dynamics Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that, I mean, I agree. I think that's such a wonderful like turn in queer culture and in queer femme culture now. You know, if you ask me like what are the moments when you felt most femme? They they wouldn't be the moments I like walked into a bar fully made up. Like the moments when I felt most femme were probably the moments I was in closest intimacy with other femmes. And usually that was in sites of care, like
Yeah.
which I agree we weren't as explicit about or we didn't really know how to talk about. But, you know, when Anna broke up with a lover and I went and slept in her bed with her and, you know, and she cried and I was there, or when I, you know, got sick and someone came over and painted my nails or massaged my back, or like when Catherine broke her knee and I was like over there and she
Yeah.
like she's like, I just need to be moisturized. So I moisturized her, you know, like her body, like, you know, these things which
Yep.
are like, things that femmes do for each other. And they're like, those are the moments when I feel most femme, really.
So beautiful.
Mhm.
I'm like tearing up. I
Yeah.
love friendship so much, and
Yeah.
it's interesting. I think like in the work I've done like around softness, like friendship is like a really strong feature of that. And I think it's just probably like you were saying earlier, it's like that's always been part of femme culture, you know, but it's just not, it's something that we can, you know, talk about and
Mhm.
politicize now, because some of the most urgent things, you know, it's just another layer
Hmm.
we can add on now. And so
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that comes out of like disability justice. It comes out
Yeah.
of like Black feminisms. Like I actually think those other discourses have allowed us to articulate femme and new ways. Like that we owe those, you know, those those traditions have fed into new ways of thinking about femme and femme community, and
Yeah.
the way we think about gender and femme in particular is like really benefited from those other conversations.
yeah, so I'm interested in thinking from hearing from your perspective, the work that femme can do politically still. Like, how does femme stay relevant now? How is femme relevant now? And what are your femme politics now? How does femme inform your politics?
I mean, the first thing that pops into my head is sort of, and I haven't really ever articulated this before, but one of the things about Brazen that we didn't have language for the way we might now, but that was very much at the core of how we thought about the book, was that femme was this very non-essentialist intersectional kind of space.
Yep.
And like I don't know if we say it in the introduction, but like, you know, for me, I identified as femme rather than female, like rather than being a woman. Like femme felt
Yep.
like in the language of the time, the way we use this word, like it felt like a transgendered position. And that comes partly out of the learning we did with Mira Soleil Ross at the time. And to me, that remains really relevant. I mean, you know, when I look at what's happening in the US around trans rights, like femme lineage is very closely tied to, you know, through Nestle's work to like the civil rights struggle of Black Americans, through the work, you know, through ballroom, through the
Mm.
struggles of like trans women and trans women of color, and like through the work of Amber Hollabaugh as sex worker, like, and of course all of those circles overlap. Like it's a multi circled Venn diagram,
Mhm.
right? Where all these, from the earliest writings on queer femme, it was always articulated in what we now call an intersectional way. And it actually for me was like, I feel like saying I was femme was the first way I was able to say I am a combination of things. Like I'm not just one thing, you know, and so I think that continues to be more relevant than ever, you know, that we have to see our struggles as connected.
When I think about what was at the heart of Brazen Femme when we conceived the anthology, and it's not an accident that it's an anthology, you know, all of these works,
Mhm.
Femme Frenzy, Brazen Femme, The Strange Sisters Cabaret, you know, even Boys Like Her are all multi-voiced works. So, you know, really centered in these cultural productions is, you know, it's a relational ways of knowing and building knowledge that are tied to civil rights movement and the need for the ongoing need for civil rights. So when I think about how femme figures now and how femme will figure in the future. I mean, that central thesis of Brazen Femme to me still feels very current. Like if we were to build the text now, what was at the core of Brazen Femme then would be at the core of Brazen Femme today.
Mm-hmm.
Because,
Mm-hmm.
what we recognize is that Brazen Femme isn't a performative identity, but that it's about something that is essential. And I'm not talking about an essential identity, but that there's a heart that's driving femme culture and femme identities. And it is about like very linked to civil rights, to equity, to coalition building movements, and the recognition that we are all more than one thing simultaneously. We're many things simultaneously. We're a part of many communities simultaneously. And and as the water rises, like so do all of the creatures in the waters, all of the boats on the water. And I feel like that is, that need for, intersectional work, I feel is still where we are and where we need to be. And I feel like this conversation could be grafted onto the conversations we were having 20 years ago. And our world is really in need for deep systemic change, and that was true then, and that I hope, I mean, I believe that probably will be true 20 years from now. But really, I have been thinking about Brazen Femme, and it's like, okay, so the place that text came from, and what's at the heart of it, and what is at the heart of, we'll say, femme identities now, femininities now. I feel like those things are not so different. Like some of the words have changed, or political understandings and conversations continue to evolve and grow. But that bonfire, the heart, or the rhizomes,
Mm-hmm.
what's happening at that level of the microorganisms at work, like kind of rooting through and aerating the soil. Those things are the same.
I would definitely agree. We talked a little bit of like lots about where femme maybe started for you, but it's like, where is femme for you now, and like how do you connect to femme now, and what does it mean to be femme outside of youth culture and outside of public culture, outside of these things?
Yeah, I feel like femme is going to be, there must be like a mathematical word for this shape, but like that there was a trough in the middle of my life where I wasn't sure if how femme was important to me. Like I wasn't sure how to think about my
Mhm.
feminist. But I feel like as I get older, femme is becoming really important to me again in my life.
Mhm.
And it's partly because my most important relationships are with femmes, and they are so sustaining. And I have such a deeper sense of my own vulnerability, my own mortality, my aging body,
Yeah.
and so I just have such a deep gratitude for those relationships in a way that I don't think I was capable of in my 20s, 30s, like really having, like, knowing the depth of that, like what that care actually meant. Like now at this age, like
Mhm.
the care I received from Anna, the care I received from my other close femme friends feels like literally like a matter of life and death. It feels like it is what
Yeah.
will keep me alive and what will allow me to, yeah, be myself until I don't get to live, until my life ends. Like, and those relationships, I have no doubt are actually extending the length of my life. I mean, we know that, right? We know relationships and like being in relationship, being connected, being loved, like these are life sustaining things. And I really like feel that very deeply in a way that I didn't before. So I feel very appreciative of my like my femme community now, which is in a way smaller and more intimate,
Mm.
less public,
Mhm.
but is, I don't know, like I was up at Anna's cabin with her and it was the morning. I got up, I was sitting down and I was looking at her in the kitchen, and she's, always cooking, chopping some vegetable. And she's in her boots because she's been outside, and she has her hair braided and she's wearing and I was like, oh my God, she's so beautiful. Like, and it's so, she's so, to me, that like there's this aura of femme that I'm like, this is so much more femme to me than any time we were like in fishnets and, you know, high heeled boots. Like it just, there's this, again, this like depth or earthiness or rootedness about it. And it's like, and so for me, that sort of gets to how I feel about femme now, is not like, it is this sort of like force in us, not, it's not like a box we sit inside, but like a force that we channel.
Chloe, I'm blushing. Thank you. That was really beautiful. Thank you.
Well, I should have told you that morning,
Oh,
but I kind of didn't want to ruin the moment. I was like, oh, I should tell Anna she looks really beautiful. And then I was like, no, I just want to appreciate
thanks, Chloe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think for myself, you know, in this continuum of that we call time, that these phases of life are not separate, you know, like being young, being middle-aged, being old. It's like, well, we're just kind of on this wave or this circle, and they're not distinct. These parts of our lives overlap and blend together. But it's been important for me to really think about, like, as I have aged and how I live my life and where I spend my time and how I spend my time looks so different, because the truth is, in my 20s, every weekend actually was you know, there were events, there were these kinds of, like, that was real. And that's not what my life looks like now. So I've been connecting my queer communities, my femme communities, my femme identity with other cultural and identity markers. So my Italian Maltese heritage. So I've been doing more learning and research and understanding that I come from a line of stregas, stregarias, witches, you know, these women in my family who were the folk healers collecting medicines, who had a way with animals, who had a way with plants. It's like, that's part of my ancestry. That's part of a future that I can imagine for myself, of being this old woman, you know, surrounded as I am now with animals and plants and connected with the earth, like grounded in something that is maybe less tenuous that I was grounded in as a younger person. It's like I feel grounded now in something very different. And it's not about, you know, anybody agreeing with me or about hearing my words validated externally or external accolades, but about I'm here. I'm here and I'm connected to something really deep that you know, I don't have all of the words for, but I feel it in my body. I feel it in connection with, you know, in deep, intimate connections with Chloe, with other deep and intimate connections, that it's relational. It's not just like I'm here and I'm alone, but it's relational and it's deep and it's, you know, and it's both, you know, through time, traveling backward and forward. And then also it's landed soil, my body, you know, the truth of this body, that it changes, and that is part of the groundedness of recognizing that this body that I'm in, it's a changing vehicle, it's a fragile embodiment of something that is much deeper and more profound. It's a spirit, right? It is something that gives me a lot of solace, that there's just a groundedness that I feel is part of, you know, my lineage, but it's also been worked for. It's also been earned. It's also, you know, something that's continuously unfolding. And it is really nice to be embraced, you know, those glints of recognition of like, hi, femme, I see you. Like, that's really wonderful. And I celebrate those moments. And I also, it's been really important for me to be able to recognize myself, and that myself is something bigger than, I think about Elizabeth Ruth and Quantum Femme. It is bigger than just this body and just this time and just this moment.
Yeah, I totally feel that. I feel like I'm a medium and I just channel this spirit. This is just the spirit I was meant to channel, you know. And I do really relate to what Anna was saying about the relational nature. I mean, I do feel like gender is really a relational thing. It makes me think of Ulrika Dahl's work a little bit, and other European femmes who have theorized femme quite differently and gender quite differently than North American femmes. It was actually about like, yeah, like what is, like, gender is this living relational thing that moves, it circulates, it's lived, it's channeled, it's whatever. And I think that's why when Anna talks about the relational is including the more than human, that's so important for me. That's been so important for me in my understanding of femme. And that's something I didn't have access to in my 20s. I couldn't, in my 20s, you know, femme was such an urban identity for me. It was an identity that revolved so much around the scene and the events and I think what I just have come to appreciate so much at this stage in my life is that what I'm in relation to has changed a lot, and that's allowed me to just experience femme as something that is not as, it's much more resilient than like the bar scene or the fashion of the day or or a relationship with my butch lover or any of the number of other things that will fade away to dust and like whether we want them to or not. And so like femme persists, right? It's like it's just waiting for you to recognize it. It's not gone anywhere because I don't actually think it's something we control. It's not like something we invented. I think it actually is just a word we use to describe something that's very ancient and very like real, like very, it's like it's one of the many strands of the universe, right? Is this feminist that is something we get to ride it. We get to surf it while we're here, and then it lasts after we're gone too. It's here after we're gone.
It's been really great spending this time with you both as well, and I love hearing all of the stories from Brazen Femme, pre-Brazen Femme times. Yeah, so thank you so much for being part of this project with me and sharing your stories.
And I just want to say, Andi, I want to just thank you for your honoring of this work of Brazen Femme. Yeah, it's been deeply meaningful, our points of connection through the conference and through this podcast. Because I think for me, like it's given me a perspective that maybe I lacked in my own life about the importance of the work, and the communities and movements that it's a part of. Because there was something very, like I remember Chloë and I were talking 2 years ago about like, God, the 20th anniversary is coming up. And we talked about, doing something, but there was the question of what would that be? And then of course we got to the year and there was just a bit of sadness for me about like this text that I feel is like, not a singular text, but a seminal text connected with, a larger movement and to just see the anniversary kind of come and go, just was sad. So I feel like that hasn't happened actually because we've been having these conversations and that you've been doing this work. So I just want to thank you, like really thank you.
I hope you'll include that in the podcast.
I will.
This podcast was created at the Center for Feminist Research at York University in collaboration with the Media Creation Lab at the Scott Library. It has been produced and recorded by me, Dr. Andi Schwartz, and edited by Rafia and Maykel Shehata. The podcast is sponsored by a number of departments at York University: the Digital Scholarship Center at the Scott Library, the Institute for Research in Digital Literacy, the Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies Graduate Program, the Sexuality Studies Program, the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and the Communication and Cultural Studies Joint Program with Toronto Metropolitan University. Thank you for listening.